Morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us. We will begin with chapter 18, verse 4. We were discussing yesterday that Yitro brings Tzipporah, Moshe's wife, and his sons, and Moshe's sons, along with to reunite with Moshe. So at the beginning of the parsha, the Torah tells us the names of Moshe's sons. The first one is named Gershom, because he was a stranger in a strange land, and that refers to his time in Midian. This, of course, was very normal during the times of the Chumash, that people would name their children based on events that have happened in their lives. And then verse 4, V'shem ha'echad Eliezer, and the name of the other was Eliezer, ki Elokei avi be'ezri, because the God of my father was in my aid, came to my aid, Vayatzileni micharev Paro, and God saved me from the sword of Paro. It's interesting. It sounds like a pretty dramatic reference. God saved me from the sword of Paro. Remember, this baby has been born before Moshe even came back, right? Before Moshe came back to Egypt to lead the Jews. We're just talking about it now, but clearly the baby was born before Moshe came back. It would seem, actually, I shouldn't say clearly. It would seem the baby was born before Moshe came back. It's not apparent. There's different views in the Mefarshim, but what's this sword of Paro that he's talking about? I mean, because I don't know, there seemed to be a pretty ongoing saga with Moshe and Paro. So just an interesting thing. Rashi on Pasuk Dal, Vayatzileni micherev Paro, kishegilu dasan vaviram al dvar hamitzri, ubikesh la'aroges Moshe. So a very interesting medrash, so Moshe sees the two Jews fighting, and Moshe says to one of them, don't strike your friend. And the other Jew says, what? You're going to kill me like you killed the Egyptian? And this is all in the Psukim. And Moshe says, oh, the matter is known. So Moshe flees. So that's all straightforward in the Psukim. And that's when he left Mitzrayim for Midian, and that's when he meets Tzipporah, so on and so forth. The Medrash inserts something that actually he got caught. Moshe got caught by the Egyptians before he fled. And Paro tried to have Moshe killed. And Nasa Tzavaro Ka'amut Shoshayish. And according to the Medrash, Moshe's neck became like stone, and you couldn't cut through it. Is this medrash to be taken literally? Is it just that the point is that miraculously Moshe was saved from Egypt? Who knows? But it's an interesting medrash that the pshat is that there was a dramatic event before Moshe escaped Egypt that God saved him from. Interesting pshat. Let's see the Sforno on Pasuk Daled. Vayatzileni mecherev Paro. Ki beleidas Eliezer kfar meis oso melech Mitzrayim shayerodef es Moshe. By the time Eliezer was born, by the time the first child was born, the king who had tried to catch Moshe was already dead. How do we know that? It says in the Psukim, Kamro, vayihi vayamim harabim mohem, vayamas melech Mitzrayim. Right? In the story leading up to Moshe, God revealing himself to Moshe, it says the king of Egypt died. Now, there's a very famous Rashi, we probably mentioned at the time. Rashi says that he got saras and he used Jewish baby's blood, all this stuff. But the straightforward meaning of the verse is the king of Egypt died. V'oz batach lios nimlat mecherev Paro. So then Moshe has faith that now he's finally off the hook. Moshe understood that he was a marked man. He was the person who had fled Egypt he was the Jew who had fled Egypt for killing an Egyptian. And he understood that if Paro would ever get wind of where he was, who knows who Paro would send after him. So that's what it means. He saved me from the sword of Paro. Not a dramatic event per se, but until Paro died, I always had to be looking over my shoulder. And now that Paro's dead, I don't have to worry about that anymore. Just an interesting pshat from this Sforno. Okay. Verse 5. Vayavo Yisro Chosein Moshe uvanav vishto el Moshe. Yisro and Moshe's family comes to Moshe el Hamidbar asher hu chonasham haru Elokim, to the desert, to the place that he was camped there, the mountain of God. I think somebody here asked me this in a previous year. Forgive me for not remembering. How did he know where to find Moshe? how do you know? So it's if you understand that the story of the splitting of the sea was big news, and if you understand that the story of the war with Amalek was big news, and you get that they're maybe going towards Israel, who knows? It's not so far-fetched to understand that Yisro had an inkling of, in other words, he knew stories that he heard news of, presumably, and that you could plot the points more or less where the Jews were. So he had an inkling where he would find them. But it's interesting just to think about how exactly did he know where they were. So it's a very interesting Orach Chaim on this pasuk. Orach Chaim on pasuk Hey Elam Bar Perish. Tomer, if you ask, Minay and Yadu Makom Tachanoso B'Midbar Gadol. The desert's a big place. How Yisro know where to find Moshe? Lozeh Omar Asher Hu Chonesham. That's why it says in the pasuk, the place that he's camped, the mountain of God, Perish. Ukvar Hodio Moshe Makom Asher Diber Ito Shamu Elokim. As we discussed yesterday, the place that God spoke to Moshe with the burning bush was the spot of Har Sinai. And God said to Moshe, the day will come where Tavdunis Elokim Alo Harazeh. Will you serve me on this mountain? Vahodio Hahar Shalav Yikablu Torah. And that God says to Moshe, this is going to be the mountain that you accept the Torah from. So this is the idea of V'timtza she'amar Rabbeinu zal she'amar Moshe Yisro nin Kabbalas HaTorah. So just a very interesting shot that Moshe, when he comes home, by the way, it does say in the Psukim that Moshe kind of asked Yisro's permission to leave, to go to Egypt. So the Orach Chaim says, is it so far-fetched to say that Moshe shared with Yisro some of the highlights of his exchange with God? I mean, this is a pretty far out thing that Moshe wants to do. So Moshe explains to him, listen, this is a big deal. And maybe one of the things that Moshe told Yisro was what we see that Hashem told Moshe, that this is going to be the place that you're going to accept the Torah upon your exodus from Egypt. So Yisro knew where Moshe had been when the burning bush happened, more or less. So he went back to the same spot. And that's why it's referred to as the mountain of God. And then very interesting pshat. Okay, let's now jump ahead to verse 21. Famous thing. Yisro convinces Moshe that it's not practical for him to be the entire judicial system of the Jewish people, and that he needs to delegate to various people to be judges. But the task of finding the right people is obviously not simple. So we're jumping in here in the middle of it. But verse 21, Yisro says to Moshe, you should find from among all of the nation, Anshe Chayil, people of distinction. Rashi says people of distinction means, or people of valor means wealthy people. That the idea is that they're not going to be bought off. Yirei Elokim, people who live with fear of God, pious people, Anshe Emes, people who are trustworthy people who are known for their honesty and morality. Sonei Votza, people who hate bribery, you're not going to be able to convince them. And you'll put them in authority over different size groups of people. Just interesting Orach Chaim on this pasuk. Orach Chaim pasuk Chaf Aleph. Yatosech hazeh perish lo sheha'am yimanu aleim. Says the Orach Chaim, when Yisro says to Moshe, you will find from among the people, there's a very specific point that he's making. The idea for who's appropriate to be judges should not be dictated by the masses. You're the leader, Moshe. You should find the right people. Elahu yachazeh. You should be the one to find them. Od Ramaz, ki letzad ze yichashev ki hu hashofet, kiven sheim shluchav v'yito chelek b'mitzvah. The Orach Chaim also says perhaps a point that Yisro is making to Moshe by saying you'll find people is that you should see these people as your emissaries. And don't feel bad. It's an interesting thing to think about. Many people in the position to do meaningful things grapple with this, right? I always feel bad for the star teacher who loves the classroom, who becomes the principal, and then he's out of the classroom. But like the whole reason he's in this is because he loves teaching. It's like that kind of picture. So Yisro says to Moshe, you should see them as being an extension of yourself. Don't feel bad. They're judging as an extension of you. So that's the other possibility the Ohr HaChaim says. But the first point he makes is you have to be the one to ascertain who's appropriate. But then it also says you should choose Mikol Ha'am from all of the nation. Perish. Gam sheyimtza b'nei Adam sheyera be'einav kihem ru'uyim ladavar afal pikein lo yamisratza bohem ad shivakesh kol ha'am b'gech hagadosh b'kulam b'chol b'chinim b'bechinos hatovos hamenuyos b'dvarav. It's not enough to find good people. It's not enough to find qualified people. You have to find the best. You have to find the best. That's your responsibility. And the only way that you can be sure you found the best is if you checked Mikol Ha'am, from among all of the people. It's an interesting comment. It's not enough to find people with qualifications. You have to make sure that you exhausted the options. It's Lahavdil Alfei Abdullah. There must be Commanders fans nodding somewhere because we're still waiting for a coach, right? You have to make sure you find, go through everybody. Okay. So now let's jump ahead to chapter 19, verse 1. Chapter 19, verse 1. In the third month from the Jewish people's exodus from Egypt, meaning they left in the month of Nisan. Nisan is month number 1, Iyar is month number 2, Sivan is month number 3. Bayom hazeh ba'u midbar Sinai. On that day, they came to the Sinai desert. Verse 2, Vayisum Refidim, they traveled from Refidim, Vayavo midbar Sinai, and they came to the Sinai desert, and they camped in the desert, and they camped there opposite the mountain. There's a lot of discussion over here. The pasuk seems like a little bit jumbled from how you would normally put it. The Ramban makes it very clear. If you look at the Ramban on pasuk Aleph, the Ramban says this is what the pasuk should have said. They traveled from Refidim. Let's start with what begins at verse 2. They traveled from Refidim. Vayachanu b'midbar Sinai. They camped in the Sinai desert. B'chodesh hashlishi, let's say Bnei Yisrael, me'eretz Mitzrayim. The third month after the Jewish people left Egypt. So first of all, the Ramban says, so basically what the Ramban's point is, the normal format for psukim is you say what they did, and then you say the date that they did it. And that's just the normal structure for psukim. And what we have here is we set the date, and then we say what they did. And even saying what they did seems to be a little bit jumbled. So Ramban is very struck by putting the date before what they actually did. And we will discuss tomorrow how he understands what's going on. So we discussed today the Rashi and the Sforno regarding the name of Moshe's second son. What's meant that he saved him from, that God saved him from the sword of Paro. We discussed Ohr HaChaim. How did Yitro know where to find Moshe anyway? We also discussed the Ohr HaChaim regarding the selection process of the judges. I